Hi, welcome back. Over and over again, we've been sharing enriching insights about education, innovation, and technology here at Bafunde on the issue. And so on today, we still want to discuss a beautiful insight, and we want to reimagine the future of online higher learning in Africa. So in reimagining this, we need to get to understand, we've been discussing about the necessary reforms we need for digital learning, among other things. And so this subject goes hand in hand or line in line with whatever previously we have been learning. Joining us is Dr. Steve Lichty, and he'll be our guest today. So Dr. Steve Lichty is the current managing partner at Rail Consultants. Besides that, he's very passionate about mentoring university and college students, and he does this at Tangazo University. My name is Leah Mokera, and I'll be your host. But just before we proceed, I'll allow him to tell us more about himself. Dr. Steve Lichty, you're welcome, and take the stage. Tell us more about yourself.
Thank you, Leah. So just a brief introduction to myself. I first came to Kenya in 2005, was working with a Swiss NGO in South Sudan, and then came back to Kenya. I fell in love with Kenya in 2005, so 15 years ago was my first exposure to East Africa, and came back here in 2010 and 11 to do my doctoral dissertation research. Looked at religion and politics in Kenya, and then finished my PhD in 2016. And I said, I want to move back to Kenya and see if I can develop a research consultancy that works with evaluation, academic capacity building, and so forth. And did that, started working initially with Tangazo University, and then a year later started working with C4D Lab, and that's where I met many of those and have mentored some of those in the room here today. So yeah, working with the University of Nairobi, and then also working with the East Africa Institute at Aga Khan University. So working with a range of actors, and then in February actually launched a business here in Kenya called Real Studio, and this is where I really want to use it as a platform for thinking about futures for Africa.
I think he is given not a brief but an elaborate definition or discussion or introduction of himself. And so before we get to this discussion, I'd ask you to invite your friends, your neighbors, your relatives to get in to join the discussion on our YouTube channel, Bafunde TV, on Twitter, Bafunde, on Facebook, Bafunde. The hashtag is enhancing learning, because really we want to enhance our learning. And so as we dive into this conversation, we will begin by getting to understand, why should we reimagine the future? This means we've already imagined it, and now we want to reimagine it. Maybe we have a new perspective that you need to learn today. So, Dr. Steve, to begin with, so what is futures thinking?
Yeah, so futures thinking is, people often think, oh, it's predicting the future. And if anything, it is not about predicting the future. The future is not real, it does not exist. But yet we have some ideas of what the future might be. But on a practical sort of level that anyone can relate to, we're thinking about our future all the time. Where should I go to school? What degree should I pursue? Should I buy this house, this property? If you're in a relationship with someone, should you pursue this relationship? So we're thinking about the future, all the time. But futures thinking is more the direct application of some tools and techniques to really think more systematically and more strategically through it. And I'll be sharing some of those here as we move along. But even here in Bafunde TV, this 4 months ago was maybe a dream or a vision. What do we want to see this doing in the future? So here we are in August 21st, 2020. And that dream, that reality is here. It's actualizing it, and so forth. So so what to me is key is being creative and being an imaginative. It doesn't have to be this prediction that on this date we would be doing this, but it's being creative and being an imaginative in that sort of regard.
Okay, when you think about the future, you have to be systematic, at least have a goal that you want to achieve in the near future. So, and in this discussion, we will be discussing about futures thinking, and I hope you can now distinguish between just normal thinking or predicting what will happen in the future or what you want, and futures thinking that's systematic, working towards a particular goal or having particular ideas that you want to achieve. So, before we get even further, so what are some of the terminologies that we are expected to use as we go through this discussion so that our audience is able to catch along? We can define a few terminologies that we will be using regarding future thinking.
Yeah, so I brought some handy little handouts here to show you just a little bit about what the future might entail. So over here is the now, and we're looking at projecting the future out. So the largest one, what are the possible futures? And then a little narrower is plausible futures. And then the probable future. Where will Kenya be 10 years from now? What is the probable future? But what is most important is maybe looking at the preferable future. What do Kenyans want to see in the future? And so if we kind of look back in this sort of space, there's signals, there's drivers, there's trends. So a good example I think of is M-Pesa. Somebody had the envision of using mobile money many years ago. And now we can't imagine what it would be like. But think of M-Pesa as a signal for what are the future sort of areas that we will be thinking of using mobile banking and these sort of things. So there's signals. So these are realities that are happening now. Drivers are what are the things behind that are driving these signals. So one of them, you know, a driver for M-Pesa was the need to put banking services into more of the population and moving them out of the banking sort of situation. So signals, drivers, trends. You can think of a forecast, and this is where you take those signals and drivers and forecast a particular sort of future. And one of those hopefully is a preferable sort of future. You can have different scenarios, and we'll talk a little bit more about scenarios as well. But you know, some other things that are kind of important here to think of is think kind of in 10-year time frames. If we think of the future 1 or 2 years out, you don't have to be as creative to kind of think 1 year out. But 10-year is kind of this sweet spot. Whereas if we say, where's Kenya going to be 30 years from now? That's a little more difficult to think about. So think of 10-year sort of time frame. So 2020 is a great time to think of 2030. We have Vision 2030 in Kenya that was written several years ago. And then maybe, you know, another important sort of point here is, you know, have strong opinions, but hold on to them lightly. Like really think that this is going to happen, but hold on to it lightly in case it doesn't happen.
That's a good point, that have strong opinions, but hold onto them very lightly. In case they disappoint you or in case they fail, there's nothing much that will really affect you. On the paper that you had, I've seen preferable and probable and preferable. On our topic, we want to reimagine the future of online higher education in learning. So, in a nutshell, what's the probable future then of higher learning, and then what's the preferable bit of higher learning in Africa? Now that I know you've studied in Africa, interacted for a while.
So a probable future is, you know, we just think of the status quo, and we think of the ongoing sort of issues, lack of school space, lack of teachers, lack of, if we're moving in the direction of online education, so many schools across Kenya do not have access to the proper bandwidth to do that. So the probable future is this will continue to be an ongoing sort of challenge. But a preferable future would be if technology can be working with schools to, say, develop solar-powered sort of systems in school to provide enough power to provide Wi-Fi access and internet access. Google, their Loon project is in the process of putting up these balloons all across East Africa, where you'll actually be able to access the internet in Turkana and Samburu and Isiolo and so forth. And so the preferable future is what often we think of as education happening in the Kenyan and more metro sort of areas. That sort of option would be existing in some very remote sort of parts of Kenya. So that's kind of speaking general, but I can share a little bit more about say online higher education here in a little bit.
Yeah, I think you will share about it, between the probable future of online specifically and the preferable. And besides, you've already put it, and that the probable future for Africans seems that it's on the negative: technology, the good bandwidth to use, the teachers. So it seems that the probable future is to the negative, while the preferable future that we have in mind is to the positive. Then how do we interconnect or get to move from the probable to a preferable? Because I'm thinking that it's good for someone to be on the preferable side of the cone.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, part of this too relates to your own sort of imagination. And if we look at, say, this chart, which is simply a kind of a 2x2 sort of matrix, and this is like saying, where is your agency? What ability do you have as a person? Do you see yourself as a powerful sort of individual? This doesn't mean that you have political power or economic power, but do you have agency and the ability to change your future? Many people in Kenya would say that they don't have this, that COVID-19, the economic decline, loss of jobs has put them down here at the bottom in a powerless sort of category. And then if you think about the future, is the world getting better or is it getting worse? And again, we kind of think, what area are we talking about? Is Kenya's access to finances via mobile banking getting worse or getting better? I think most people would say it's actually getting better. We have more access to this. But the use of plastic, Kenya banned plastic bags a couple years ago. So it is amazing. If we think back 3-4 years ago, do you remember the plastic bags that would just float through Nairobi? So we've actually changed. Kenya has changed the future of the use of plastic bags. Now we need to do this with plastic bottles and some other sort of things. But everyone says, Kenya cannot ban plastic bags. We have to have this. It's like, no, Kenya, you did it, and I think it's great. And so this is just a helpful way of thinking, do you have power for your future career? And is the career prospects for you getting better or are they getting worse? So, this sort of simple 2x2 sort of matrix, you can put anything on this XY axis and kind of think of that. And then I'll talk a little bit about a futures triangle, which is another sort of approach to looking at this.
I just have one question for that. XY, this. What if I lie on this quadrant? It's getting worse and I'm powerless.
And you're powerless.
Hopeless?
But to me, the first stage of wrestling with this is acknowledging where you are. Yeah. And so if this is where you are, then it's helpful to just acknowledge that that's where it is. So where can you possibly be more optimistic and think of those sort of areas? Or what are the things that you can do to empower yourself? And I mean, I think this represents an important sort of narrative and dialogue that is important for Africans to wrestle with, because so much of the narrative that fills this quadrant is actually being driven by very powerful sort of people, either Kenyan politicians and the economic elite, or the international sort of community that has historically, for good or bad, interfered in Kenyans' future and so forth. So if we can move Kenyans from here to here, a lot of the future narrative that Kenyans want to build change for that preferable future will change. And so you think of it as baby steps. You don't need to go from here to here overnight. But if you're over here, in a few years you're here, in a few years you're here, you can slowly begin moving in that direction.
Slowly, and you'll get there.
Yes. What is the saying? Haraka, haraka.
Haraka, haraka, haina baraka. Pole,
haina baraka.
Ndio mwendo.
Yes. Okay. I learned that many years ago when I was taking my Swahili lessons.
sawa, pole pole ndio mwendo. So let's move step by step, and in the long run you'll be where you should be. The essence is to at least make a move or a step or a change towards the positive side. So talking about futures thinking, we have different types of futures thinking. Will you get us through so that we will understand?
Yeah, so I think there's three maybe areas that we could talk about just briefly. One, which is a very general sort of term, is what they call futures literacy. So when we think of literacy, it means you're literate, you're familiar with this material, literature, letters, words, sentences, paragraphs, all of those are components of being literate, like you can read.
Yeah.
So futures literacy is very similar. It's like you're familiar with some of the terminology and so forth, and you're able to use it. Most people are actually future literate. They just don't necessarily know it. Like they're thinking about their future and they're making strategic plans. But then a subset of that would be futures thinking, which is more the applied use of certain tools and, you know, the drivers, the signals, forecasting, backcasting, building scenarios, preferable futures. These are all kind of terminologies that we use within futures thinking. And then there's maybe even a more specific sort of subset called strategic foresight. And this is more the applied use of it in certain settings. So businesses, KPMG and Deloitte and Kenya Commercial Bank, all of these have kind of strategic foresight divisions. Where are interest rates going to be? Where is the Kenyan currency vis-a-vis the euro and the US dollar? Where are they going to be? So there's the strategic foresight, which is a very applied in a very specific sort of area. So future policy for Kenya, any sort of military strategy. Where is Kenya's conflict with Somalia going to be? So you'll be looking at strategic foresight there. So those are just some of the areas. And then maybe the one that I am most passionate about and I think is really important is participatory futures. So participatory futures is really saying, hey, Kenya, where do you want to go? Where is your preferred future? Vision 2030 was designed by the elite in Kenya. And I think they probably had some collaboration and they worked with some local communities. But the participatory futures is when you're really going into communities and saying, where do you want to be? So I know that part of Kenya's new constitution is the counties actually have to have so many sessions where they're actually inviting the public to be involved in that. And I think that's a great first step for them. But is the agency of those in these communities thinking of preferred futures? Like Turkana County, we want to see, the county going in this sort of direction. And so I think there's this huge need to really see Kenyans equipped with the tools to have this preferable future and to articulate it, to build it out.
I wanted to intertwine this types of futures, strategic, participatory to higher education learning. So how do we intertwine them?
Yeah, so I have a chart for that, which is called a futures triangle. And so it's simply a triangle that is at the top is the pulls, pushes, and the weights. So the pushes are what is driving us forward with online, to a particular future. So just what is the future of online higher education? It's been around, but it hasn't been put into like every major university right now.
COVID is now pushing us.
Is pushing us. So COVID is a huge pusher. But prior to COVID-19 was just the reality that universities wanted to get education into more people's hands. And so any business professional is working 40, 50, 60 hours a day. You can't attend class. So you need to do online classes in the evening. So that was kind of a previous push. And just the idea that Kenyans take great pride in their education. And there was always a desire to see more education. So online was an opportunity to do that. So those are some of the pushes. Some of the weights, we know what some of the weights are. They're, lack of bandwidth, lack of internet, You need
The
computers.
correct devices,
Yeah, you need
yeah.
devices and so forth to do this. Like I've been on numerous Zoom sessions with many Kenyans, and if you're not technologically savvy, that Zoom screen can just be so frustrating. Where is my mute? And
sharing the screen.
sharing
How do
the
I share a
screen, and people's who camera is for some reason down here in front of them, and all you see is up their nose. So people are still learning how to do this. So
Yeah.
there's things that are holding this back, but even here in Bafunde, you've been around for a month and you're still learning how to do these sort of things. So there's some of the weights, but the pushes. If we think of the pushes, if we think of just the youth demographics in Kenya, we need more of this. The number of 10 to 25-year-olds in Kenya, we can't meet their education needs with the current sort of system. So those are some of the polls. So this is, as a future triangle, it's a brainstorming exercise where you simply think of what are the pushes, what are the signals and drivers and trends, and then we can build some forecasts out. So forecast A would be just business as usual. Nothing really changes. Where are we going to be in 10 years if nothing changes? But what is a worst case scenario? If all of a sudden we're needing more power to supply Wi-Fi access and so forth, and Kenya's current fiber optic system cannot manage that, then we're going to see a worst case sort of scenario.
That is big.
But C is our preferred future. And this is where we are building out this preferred future where you have the capabilities, you have the bandwidth, you have the tools, teachers are equipped. The entire ecosystem, in other words, is happening, and there's a way to really engage with people. And so one of the things I was hoping to be able to do today is just share a little bit about Miro. So Miro is an online, it's essentially an online whiteboard, but it's collaborative. So anyone who has the link to that Miro URL can go in and put sticky notes and draw and paste. And this is actually one of the frames from a Miro presentation that I have. So Real Consulting Group, 2 months ago, we launched a Futures Fellowship. And so we're working with 6 university students, Mauritius, Rwanda, Mozambique, Kenya, I think is where the four countries. And and my colleague, business partner, we are walking them through, a lot of what we're doing here. So we're kind of like on our 7th session, and we're going to be wrestling with some really, fascinating sort of things. So this is kind of was the tool that I was using with them to help them think through, because it really is a creative sort of process. So these sticky notes are actually notes that we stuck into Miro, and they were collaborating and putting their comments in and everything. So a tool like that, I think, will be essential, because one of the things that we do miss in a Zoom session is you have the chat feature, you can share a screen, but it's not that creative space that really allows everyone to take their sticky notes and go up to a board and really work in that sort of collaborative sort of space.
So we have sent the push, but what are the polls pulling us into that?
So yeah,
I have seen that paper has push, then has pull, and then we have the preferable.
Yeah, so a poll will be just thinking of in 2030, we are going to have so many more young people needing education. So the future is pulling us toward meeting this need. And in some ways, I think online education is more flexible at meeting the ability to build skills for future. So I think there's going to be some future careers that we don't even think about right now that we're going to need. And the university system, not just in Kenya, but globally, is not this agile, fast changing sort of institution.
Yeah, it is
to
not.
do curriculum development, to develop new undergraduate degrees, master's degree takes years of working through all the system. But online education, I think, is very flexible and can develop tools very quickly to meet these sort of needs. So it will just be the future technological needs that we need in Kenya. Online education will be able to meet that with not even a degree program, but simple online ways of accessing it. So if you go to Coursera or edX or any of these sort of global online education providers, you can find anything that would be of interest to you. And a lot of them you can actually take for free. So there's great ways of doing that. So to me, it will be the needs for specific education and skill sets will be one of the biggest pulls, plus just this large youth population coming also. Up. Yeah.
Okay. Now, having discussed where Kenya stands in the future, and not only Kenya but Africa, we've seen the pull, the pushes, we know the hindrances that we have as a country or as a continent, and we can work towards solving or toppling up over these hindrances to get to a desired future where we need to be. So let's get practical, and Dr. Steve will give us an example of how we can actually apply futures thinking, and particularly to a challenge that is currently facing Africa.
Yeah, so I think of two areas that I think futures thinking would be a really powerful sort of way. And one, let me give the first example, which is the donut economy, donut economics. So this is Kate Raworth. She's a British economist out of Oxford University, and she created a donut economy. So when we think of economic growth, it's generally linear. It's more GDP, it's higher income for everybody, and so it's linear, but the reality is we do not have the capacity on the planet to have everyone to have everything that we would. The preferred future would be, yes, everyone has a 7-bedroom mansion with a swimming pool and 8 cars and all this sort of stuff. That, maybe that is your preferred future, but it is not likely for 7.3 billion people to all have this. Yeah. So this is representing the notion that we have to think of things in a circular sort of fashion. So this is regenerative economics. This is circular economics. And what Kate is essentially saying is we have to think of, on the outer sort of circle is an ecological ceiling. So the future has to be acknowledging that ecological ceiling, that our water, our use of power, our use of clean energy versus coal or oil, these are going to influence our ecological sort of ceiling. But on the inner circle is a sociological kind of foundation, that if you go below this, then you deal with poverty, you deal with people not having healthcare, not having education, not having clean water. So the sweet spot is finding this area in the middle where we can find this sort of balance. So that would be, and there's a lot of futures thinking already happening in this sort of space. But the other area that I think would be intriguing, that I think everyone in Kenya would agree is an issue, is corruption. And this is everything from kidogo kidogo when you're stopped by the police and you're not wearing your mask or something like that, all the way to Jack Ma, the Chinese businessman, donating all of this sort of stuff to deal with COVID in Kenya. Yeah. And lo and behold, we can't find where a lot of this went. And somebody has managed to take that money and take the masks and take the personal protective, equipment and so forth. But even more importantly, I've been in Kenya long enough to know that corruption is a huge issue. So I think, many of you are familiar with blockchain, and it's like, and I still don't fully understand blockchain, but everyone says, look, this is a secure way of saying if the money is in this space, it takes a multitude of people to be able to pull that out, and people aren't going to agree to that. So just this idea of what would blockchain look like if the government was using it, if every county, if all 47 counties in Kenya were using blockchain, so that their allotment from the Kenya government, national revenue, goes to these county governments, and there is blockchain in all of these sort of counties, I think in many ways Kenya has amazing sort of resources. Their people, the tourism, all these sort of things. So it's not a poor country. In fact, Kenya is now kind of ranked in this middle income sort of category. Countries. Yeah. And I mean, that's exciting, but then you don't have to go very far to realize, wow, there's a lot of people on the top end who've pulled us into that middle category. And there's a lot of people, unfortunately, who are still not doing well. So what is the future of blockchain for addressing corruption in Kenya? I think would be a great sort of discussion to actually have and bring 15, 20 Kenyan youth, economics, political science, law, sociology, environment, bring a whole range of disciplinary sort of perspectives and say, let's dream. Let's see, what does our preferable future look like with using blockchain to deal with corruption. And then you would wrestle with the what are the weights, what are the pulls, what are the pushes, and so forth in that regard. So those are just kind of two real quick sort of examples of how I think you could use it in two really important ways that affect all of Kenyan.
Okay, we'll take a break, but after the break, we'll get to a real-time solution in the education space and how we can use future thinking to solve a real-time solution that's currently affecting African countries in the education space. So see you right after the break, but you can drop your question or your comment on either of the handles, Facebook or Twitter, Bafunde, and still on the live chat on YouTube, you can drop your question or your comment. So see you then after the break.
Are you a lecturer? Are you a tutor? Are you an instructor? Do you wish to make learning efficient and effective? You can now reach out to your learners online using technology. Introducing Bafunde. Bafunde supports trainers and educators in organizations, universities and colleges to prepare and deliver digital content to boost interactions and learning. Visit our website at bafunde.com and register now. Bafunde, enhancing learning. Are you a lecturer? Are you a tutor? Are you an instructor? Do you wish to make learning efficient and effective? You can now reach out to your learners online using technology. Introducing Bafunde. Bafunde supports trainers and educators in organizations, universities and colleges to prepare and deliver digital content to boost interactions and learning. Visit our website at bafunde.com and register now. Bafunde, enhancing learning.
Welcome back, and we proceed from where we left it. And as we said that we're going to look at an example specifically on the education sector. We've seen corruption in Africa that you and me are very conversant with, that it's a real-time problem, and gotten a solution, or rather a futures thinking solution. So we will look at an example that's under the education line or the learning sector, and then we can proceed. So is there an example you think where we need to apply futures thinking besides online learning? Any other thing?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I find exciting about futures thinking is it is cross-cutting. It works across multiple sort of sectors, and it's cross-disciplinary. So one of the kind of historical challenges that Kenya has faced is you proceed to receive a degree for multitude of reasons. And so I just remember when I was doing my research, I was interacting with 30 and 40-year-old Kenyans, and I would inquire about their education, and they would say something like, well, I got my law degree, and that was for my dad. And then I went to medicine, or I went to, accountancy or something. So there's still this kind of phenomena where there are certain kind of social or family expectations of what you pursue, degree-wise at the university. And so that's just kind of a historical, cultural sort of factor, that you honor your parents and that you pursue what they really want you to do, but it maybe doesn't align with what your interests are or what your skill set is. So there needs to be, one, just some really good flexibility with pursuing the degree that you want. But then Kenya's education system is still really built around silos. So you enter a disciplinary sort of silo, and you don't ever really go beyond that.
Yeah.
And that model maybe worked 50 years ago, but it's not working. It's not working today. So unfortunately, most universities still are very, like I said earlier, very rigid in their ability to break those sort of silos down. But even going beyond just one university, when I was doing my research here in 2010 and 11, part of what I was doing was visiting, I don't know, I probably was in 10, 15, 20 different universities, engaging with professors and scholars and so forth, and was always kind of amazed at how even faculty and students as well in universities would not realize that 10 kilometers up the road was this university, with these majors, with these degrees, with these libraries, with these sort of resources and so forth. And so futures thinking really, again, it's imaginative, it's critical thinking, and it's multidisciplinary. And so one of the things that will need to happen is moving students out of these kind of disciplinary sort of perspectives. So C4D Lab, where some of the people behind the cameras and the headphones here, they participated in this problem-based fellowship program at C4D Lab. So this is at the university's Department of Computer Science, but these fellows were coming from law and medical anthropology and business and sociology and a range of areas that the fellowship was taking them through human-centered design thinking, some really powerful sort of tools to wrestle with, the application of technology and making it user-friendly and, more effective. So futures thinking is drawing on all of that to say, now where do we want to go in the future? So when you start wrestling with, if you receive training in futures thinking, the design thinking, systems thinking, human-centered design, complexity theory, all of these are components of. So, the short answer to your question is really breaking a lot of those disciplinary boundaries down and letting students pick. Like my undergraduate degree was, my college allowed you to pursue what they called an interdisciplinary degree. So it allowed me to pick 3 disciplines, and they essentially was combining 3 minors. So you would normally do a major, which was, 60 hours of credit or whatever, and a minor was like 20 hours. So by combining 3 minors, you could have this major. So I picked business, economics, and communication. So I think I took 5 courses in each of those areas. And so then my undergraduate is interdisciplinary sort of studies, and then I actually can spin that kind of however I want. If I'm looking at more an economics sort of position or needing to get into that space, then I put economics at the front. If I've worked in public relations and media, then I emphasize the communication side of things. So, I think that would be one way of allowing students to really say, hey, I want to do anthropology and engineering, for example, because you're really interested in, say, developing prosthetics for people. And so you need to really understand the sociological, anthropological side of things, but then you need that engineering sort of perspective of how to build, prosthetic arms for people.
That's a good aspect, breaking down the disciplinaries. It helps so that by the time you're now finished with undergraduate, you can picture out really what was your interest. Your minor can actually become your interest as time goes by. Hopefully, if the Kenyan economy or African countries or African institutions of higher learning will incorporate this, that will be a huge plus, a big plus. But before we proceed, there's a question on Facebook from Dr. Tony, and he asks, I'll be interested to get pointers on how individuals can shape the future and how they can practically own and shape it. I think I should repeat this question.
Yeah, repeat it while I think of my response.
He will be interested to get pointers on how individuals can shape the future and how they can practically own and shape it. How individuals can shape the future is the first bit.
Yeah. So one, you just start with your own personal sort of life. So let's put this in the context of, say, kind of everyone in this studio right now. All of you are university grads, and you're thinking of your future. Let's just go to the future triangle and say, my future in working with a television studio and putting material into the public. What are the pushes, the pulls, and the weights from that? So you can simply take those sort of tools. If you Google a maybe slightly cheeky way of responding to this is, go to Google and put in, what is the future of, and fill in the blank. What is the future of corruption in Kenya? What is the future of online education? This is kind of maybe the lazy way of doing it, but what it'll do is, when you see the results, you'll see where people are thinking and what they're wrestling with. But yeah, if you just look at the simple tools that I've kind of mentioned, what are the signals? What do we see today that are suggesting we're going in a certain direction? One that just popped into my mind was the closed circuit TV, the security cameras that are all over Kenya that you see if you're driving at night, although the curfews kind of stopped people from, cruising through Nairobi. But that, has, the future of that has deterred carjackings, immensely in Nairobi, knowing that you're being watched. On all these sort of streets. So that, the crime rate was the driver of how do we wrestle with this sort of thing. But yeah, I think if you just Google that, if you look at just the futures triangle and think of just the pulls, the weights, those are just some really practical sort of tools. Do the 2x2 sort of matrix. Where do you feel like you are empowered? And it kind of relates to your question, Leah, of what do you do if you're over here in kind of this quadrant where you're not empowered and so forth. And yeah, I think it is an incredibly tough sort of position if you're in a space in Kenya. If you're a single mother and you've lost your job, and we talk about the Kenya hustle. The Kenya hustle is actually futures thinking applied writ large all across the country, because your hustle is, how do I survive? I'm going to sell pineapple or avocado. What is the future of those two, fruit? If you're trying to sell pineapple when it's not in season, that's probably not, a good future. But if avocados are falling off the tree, then that's where you focus. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, Tony. But
I think you have answered it. I'm thinking, so practically to shape it, you need to understand the pulls, the pushers, and then get your hindrances for you to maybe get the pointers on where you are headed in the future.
Yeah, and to also, but to also just do some self-reflection.
I thought we begin with self-reflection first.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So start with self-reflection.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think that's a crucial sort of first step. And I don't think a lot of times, maybe pre-COVID, the Kenya hustle just had everyone always on the go, and you never stop to kind of think. And so people call COVID-19 as the global pause, where we literally seem to have like hit the double bar and things stopped. Yes, the world continued to going on, but what is going on? So I know that for some people this has been incredibly stressful time, and the days just drug on. For me personally, I can't believe it's now August, that we're halfway through 2020. And so things have moved fast for me. But for those that are struggling, where do you have maybe just that little bit of agency to make some change? And you work with that and go from there.
That's a beautiful insight. I hope, Dr. Tony, you've been answered. So we get to understand that the TIE is a show that talks about technology, innovation, and education, or rather it unpacks the intersection between these three. And in our previous shows or discussions, we've discussed about online education. Specifically, we had necessary reforms for digital education. We had a discussion on the sufficient things that need to be done for education, or rather online learning, to take up or to step up. So what do you think are some of other areas or other unique or important areas that we need to be added into this aspect, especially regarding futures thinking?
Yeah, so let me just go to what some of the fellows are doing, with the fellowship that we're working at. So what I like about futures thinking is, where is your passion and what are you interested in? Because then there's actually some way of working with that with futures thinking. So I have one student from Kenya, and she's wanting to look at what is the future of refugee populations in Kenya. They often, I think the agency would be incredibly low in some of these places where you are kind of trapped in this camp. Dadaab is an example of what do you do in this sort of space. So what is the future of refugee camps? Because climate change is going to displace people, and conflict is going to displace people. And so what is the future of working with these sort of populations that don't have a home? They're living in a tent. They're not in their home country. They're not wanted in this country. What is the future for those sort of population? So not just Kenya, but Sudan and Syria and Yemen, the Rohingya in Myanmar, getting pushed out of that country into Bangladesh. So it's applicable in that regard. Enias is working with climate smart agriculture in Zimbabwe. What is the future of using your phone as and we already have some kind of rudimentary, what are the prices of this and weather forecasts and this sort of stuff. But I think there's ways of utilizing this sort of technology that is really smart. If there's a sensor that you can plug into your phone, stick the sensor into the soil, it tells you this area needs more fertilizer, this area needs less, things like that. The same with healthcare. If you download a sleep app on your phone, put it into your bed, and it will record what you're doing at night. How good is your sleep and so forth. Couple other sort of areas is looking at what they call the triple nexus, and I think this is really relevant to Kenya. So the triple nexus is reference to humanitarian and relief work, development work, and peace and conflict sort of transformation. So in Mozambique got hit with 2 cyclones within like a couple of months of each other. And so a cyclone just did huge destructive sort of damage in northern Mozambique, and then 2 months later, another one goes through. And so what is the future of government? What is the future of governments like Mozambique to respond to humanitarian aid sort of disasters, building the economic development? But then this has historically been an area where different anti-government rebel groups, factions have been fighting the government. And so in this chaos, those groups, have space to, wreak even more havoc. So what is the future of that? So, those I think are certain areas. One of the areas that I'm looking at is within the body of futures thinking and studies. We're really curious to know, how do our understandings of the futures change from when you're 20 or 30 to when you're 50 or 60. So obviously, all of you here in this room have a 40, 50 year kind of perspective on the future. If you're 60, you're not thinking about 50 or 60 years down the line, unless you hope to live to 120 or so. But life expectancy in Kenya is increasing. So what are the differences between how a Kenyan thinks about the future? If we would bring 20, 60-year-old Kenyans into this room and ask them, what is the future of online education? We're going to get a very different perspective than if I would ask you, what is the future of online? So there is a difference. So looking at how does age influence the way we think about the future? And then the other one that I'm really excited about is looking at how trauma, both primary and secondary trauma. So primary trauma is when violence, for example, has been perpetrated against you. Yeah. If you were abused as a child, if you were carjacked, if you were recruited by Al-Shabaab against your will, you're experiencing primary trauma. Secondary trauma is you're experiencing it, as a secondary force. So let's say that you're a spouse of a police officer who responded to the Westgate attack, and the security forces that respond to that went into great, chaos and mayhem and so forth, and they experienced a trauma because they saw their fellow countrymen being killed, right in front of them. But their spouses, the spouses of those officers, are going to experience some of the secondary trauma. And so what I'm looking at in partnership with the Green String Network is, how do you help people, first of all, wrestle with that trauma? You have to acknowledge it. You have to acknowledge that I'm traumatized. And when you start looking at the neurobiological realities in our brain, that, without going into great neurological sort of discussion, futures thinking really comes from our neocortex, our frontal cortex, which is kind of the engine that drives so much of our creativity and critical thinking is embedded here in the frontal part of our brain. The back of our brain, our reptilian sort of brain, this is what we do without even thinking. If somebody is attempting to rob you or mug you, this part of the brain immediately decides what to do. Do you fight? Do you flee? Do you freeze? What do you do? We don't even think about it. We don't have some philosophical discussion, from the neocortex at this point of, oh, what is happening? And please tell me about your mother and why are you robbing me? And, we don't go into these sort of discussions with somebody like that. So, if you've experienced a lot of trauma, and I think poverty, unfortunately, can cause trauma. Yeah. And we don't think about it because it's just the norm. But I did not grow up with poverty. So I did not experience the lack of food, the lack of a school uniform, the lack of a proper shelter and so forth. So that has enabled me to automatically kind of be in a completely different position to think about the future. But for those that have experienced trauma, let's work with getting you into greater sort of capacity. Let's move you from this bottom quadrant that we had and work you out of that sort of space. So it relates to mental health in Kenya. Mental health is still incredibly taboo in Kenya. It's getting there. We're learning more and more about it and its effects and so forth. But just mental health from just a standard sort of way of thinking of our well-being, as individuals, trauma will play a role in that, and equipping the people living in Garissa and Wajir, deal with this all the time because of the threats of Al-Shabaab and police that have not had proper sort of training and skill set to wrestle with their own sort of trauma. So they're trying to battle Al-Shabaab in these sort of areas, and they're experiencing their own sort of trauma because they've just lost some of their colleagues due to an explosion or a roadside attack or something like that, moving out of Lamu or something like that. So it's this really kind of thick sort of ecosystem that you have to wrestle with. So those are some of the areas that I think are really exciting and are really oriented around this participatory future concept that I talked about earlier, of taking it out of the futurists and the strategic foresight experts who publish and wrestle with it at this realm. But what happens if we pull those skill sets and bring them down into Mathare and Kagame and Kibera and places like that? To what do you envision? What do you see, and so forth. So those are just some of the other sort of areas that we could think about.
I think we'll need to have another discussion on mental health and how it affects education, age, and even humanitarian aid or things related to humanitarian ideas within Kenya, because they affect futures thinking, and in the long run they may be intertwined with education or the innovation or anything.
Yeah, so technology, innovation, and education. I mean, all three of those have their own sort of future. What is the future of innovation? So creativity, and two people in this room have heard, I think, this story that I've shared. Think back to how you learn when you took art class in Kenya when you were 10 years old. The teacher would put a picture on the wall. And your job was to duplicate that picture. So if it's a beach scene from Mombasa, the palm trees are green, the sand is beige, and the water is blue. Now, if you want to go all Picasso on this and do purple palm trees and an orange beach and a green ocean, the teacher probably is not going to be too pleased with your creative license. And that's really, really unfortunate. I think some of the most creative people in Kenya are actually the musicians, the street artists, anyone who has a successful hustle has creatively figured out how to do that. That needs to be that innovation that we're fostering. And then education needs to be moved out of this understanding of it's a university degree. It's in this silo, it's in this box. The future is really going to be not what degree do I have, but what can I show you? When you pull out your portfolio, your digital portfolio, because that's what it'll be. You'll go into an interview in the future, and your employer will be looking at your digital portfolio. So for all of you in this room, you'll be pulling up things that you've done here to say, this is some of the skill sets that I have.
Before we proceed, we have a question. There is the question. There is a concern of people looking back, more historical and less of how exciting the future could be. How do we cultivate a powerful spirit of consistent futuristic thinking? That's nice.
Yeah, that's really good. And that's actually a really good question and a really good point. So because the future is not real, the only thing that is real is kind of our understanding of the past.
Yes.
So we have rich historical sort of understandings. We have the history books, we have photos, we have people's personal memories of the past. And what you need to be able to do to build these preferable futures is, what are all of the aspects of that past? So you could, many people talk about the 7 spheres, 8 spheres: politics, economics, technology, science and technology, media, arts, church, family, education, entertainment, these kind of broad sort of sectors. All of those would be components of the past that when we talk about Kenya's past, pick 1970, 7 years after independence, where is Kenya at that point? And there'd be this rich sort of understanding. Kenya is probably still at this amazing sort of state of, we are independent from the British. Kenyatta is president. We're moving forward into the future. So now you would take all of those sort of narratives and you would put labels for all of those into the future. And then how do you creatively build each one of those out? So it'd be almost more like you jump ahead, not 10 years, but here's where you would jump 50 years ahead and say, let me tell the story from 2030. So it's this creative space of moving across multiple sort of time frames to say, look, Kenya has this history of marathon runners. It's part of our story. It's part of our history. We are the fastest human beings, on the face of the earth. You probably will still be fast in 2030. But what happens if you're also fast on a bike? So I love to cycle, and I think my profile said that I prefer cycling over flying. It depends upon how far we're going. But as a cyclist, there's no reason why in 2030 Kenyans, and maybe not just Kenyans, but Ethiopians and Rwandans and so forth, are winning the Tour de France. That skill set of being fast on your feet, you can be just as fast on a bike. So where does that look like? Well, that will require having more bikes, better bikes, great roads, and the ability to train in Kenya. And I've cycled up in Kiambu and Limuru sort of area, and these roads are really, really nice. And you can get some great training in at high altitudes, lots of hills. So there's no reason why there will not be a Kenyan winning the Tour de France, in 2030.
So I hope the viewer is answered, but I will just want to ask one question. So can I use my past to predict the future?
Yeah, that's really the only way to
do it.
To do it.
Okay.
Yeah, but let's say that your past is filled with not a lot of positive sort of things.
Yeah, that's
so.
That was my next
So let's say that you come from an area where you don't know your father. You grew up in poverty. You only made it to standard 2 or 3 before you had to drop out because your mother couldn't pay the school fees. But if you talk to a lot of successful people, and successful meaning not Bob Cullimore, but somebody who has gone on and pursued something, hear their stories. They were once in that sort of place. And so again, this agency, this idea that your mental health is so important. If your trajectory has taken you to substance abuse, if you're sniffing glue, drinking the special brew that they make that essentially will poison you, will kill you, will cause you to go blind, that is not a great sort of future for you. And unfortunately, a lot of people, that's all they can predict. But there are people who do get out of that. That actually would be a fascinating sort of research, is to say, what future did you envision when you were on Thika Road in rags, walking up and down the street looking for a few bob to make ends meet. So yeah, I hope that I can be encouraging to those sort of people, but it is a tough go in those sort of spaces. But I would hope that many Kenyans of middle class and upper class sort of nature would envision something as well where all of Kenya is flourishing, not just the middle class, but all of Kenya, all 48 million Kenyans, everyone is flourishing.
As we almost climax in this discussion, are you conducting any research on future thinking? And if you are, what exactly are the insights you've gotten? And then besides that, if I wanted to learn or get to understand more about future thinking, are there trainings, or how can I educate myself on future thinking so that I don't just think about the future haphazardly, imagining this or that, or predict my own things, but really systematically know how to balance my future. And you will,
Yeah. So, yeah, just to kind of revisit a couple of the areas that I said. One was just looking at how do Kenyans think about the future? What are those differences? And how does, across Africa, there's really a cultural understanding of youth that is very different from a lot of in many parts of the world. So youth, constitutionally, legally in Kenya, youth is defined as between 18 and 35.
Yes.
That's a huge range. And we know this intuitively, but we still keep saying the youth. Oh, the youth issue, youth. Well, are we talking about 18-year-old youth? Or are we talking 35-year-old that is married, has a family, and 2 kids? There still kind of is this understanding that there's kind of qualifiers that immediately kind of get you maybe out of youth. If you marry at 22 and have kids and are struggling to make a living, you're still going to be a youth. But if you're 24 and get married and land a job at Equity Bank and drive a Land Rover and all that sort of stuff, you kind of move yourself out of the youth sort of status. So it's this very kind of strange sort of space of what you're looking at. But the agency that is there is going to be very, very different for an 18-year-old versus a 35-year-old. Whereas in a lot of other parts of the world, like in the United States where I'm from, 18 is kind of the mark of adulthood. Like, we can ship you off to foreign wars at 18 and entrust you with multi-million-dollar military equipment. You're going to grow up really fast. And yeah, you move out of home, you go to college, we can drive when we're 16. You have a car, you have independence. I was 18 years old driving clear across the United States, multi-day sort of journeys. I don't think a lot of Kenyans envision an 18-year-old
Dry.
Let's go to Kampala, for the weekend. You just, you don't do that. So there's different understandings of agency and what does that future look like, but then also, what are your family expectations? I think it's slowly changing, but I think a lot of your parents have probably had a discussion with you at some point saying, you really should go to medical school, or I really want you to be an engineer. That's a reality. And so, in the past, people, would do that. So yeah, just looking at the age difference, the cultural sort of understandings of future, and as I mentioned, the whole idea of looking at trauma, primary and secondary, and those sort of things of how does that really influence? Because again, one of my biggest sort of issues is the global north, the Western sort of societies have these sort of powerful sort of narratives. They're coming from a wealthy perspective. And have a certain way of thinking of the future, and it's like, what do participatory futures look like at a base sort of level? So for training perspectives, there are some great sort of resources online. So if you just even Google, how do you get training as a futurist? I know that Coursera does a 5-course training that if you manage it within the time frame that they allow you to do it for free, I think it's either 4 to 6 weeks. But if you work through it quickly and diligently, you can actually get through all 5 courses, and you're going to learn about drivers and signals and forecasting and scenarios. And the courses offered by the Institute for the Future, I call it IFTF. It split off from the Rand Corporation in the United States in the early 70s or early 60s, but it's in Palo Alto, California, so it's smack dab in the middle of Silicon Valley in the United States. So it has a very technical, logical sort of focus, but here you can actually get a certificate in futures thinking that is recognized, and once you're kind of in the IFTIF sort of sphere, you get invited to these amazing sort of webinars and sessions. So I was just on one yesterday. An architect in the United States was talking about world building. and fascinating sort of conversation. So here's a great place to get your kind of foot in the door. I've taken training from Suhail Iniatola, who is a Pakistan futurist based in Australia. The futurist community to me has been one of the most welcoming and least hierarchical sort of organization. So I've been engaging with people at UNDP and Interpol and the UN. Somebody who, yes, I have a PhD, but I have really no futures qualifications, but just doing those sort of trainings and getting this sort of insight. So I have certification from Tam Kang University in Taipei. And I think that was $100 for me to get that sort of training. It was all online and so forth. And then I'm working with this Real Futures Fellowship, which is a great opportunity. You know, they say the best way to learn anything is to go teach it, teach it yourself. And so working with these 6 students from University of Nairobi and Africa Leadership University in Mauritius and Kigali campuses. And yeah, I mean, reach out to you. People can get my email address. I'm more than happy to point anyone in this direction, because what I would love to see in Kenya so my future for futures, to use that phrase, would be in 2030, we have 3 or 4 universities in Kenya that are offering at least a certificate, if not a diploma, if not an undergraduate degree in futures thinking. So at the moment, the only place that you can get a postgraduate diploma or certificate, I can't remember, postgraduate certificate, a master's, and a PhD. So you can actually get a PhD in futures studies for strategic foresight, is at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. So it is the only institution on the continent. So 1 billion people, and Stellenbosch is the only place to do it. Otherwise, Finland and Australia, the Philippines, the US, there's a couple of places in Germany, have some really good universities that are dealing with futures thinking. But start small. Start with these free online sort of resources. Reach out to me. More than happy to put you in contact with the right sort of people. But I would love to see 1,000, 10,000 people in 10 years trained to be working with futures thinking across a range beyond technology, innovation, and education. But healthcare, agriculture, all these sort of areas that need this sort of strategic foresight to build these preferable futures that really makes Kenya this amazing sort of country that people are actually fighting to get into, and not Kenyans wanting to go, someplace else. Yeah.
Okay. Orfa Nyakundi on YouTube says, wonderful and thoughtful topic. Aino Komamba says, very insightful. And so this marks the end of today's show. We've learned about the future. We realize that while we reimagine the future of education, or rather higher learning education, we cannot fail to talk about futuristic thinking, which has covered a huge scope from mental health to age, and there is a lot to learn. So don't forget to subscribe on the Bafunde TV channel so that you're able to get a notification on the next show for enriching and beautiful insights. So thank you, dear viewer, for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Steve, for joining us.
Thank you.
The pleasure is all ours, and you're welcome again.
Okay, great.
Thank you, and see you. Stay safe until next time.
Are you a lecturer? Are you a tutor? Are you an instructor? Do you wish to make learning efficient and effective? You can now reach out to your learners online using technology. Introducing Bafunde. Bafunde supports trainers and educators in organizations, universities, and colleges to prepare and deliver digital content to boost interactions and learning. Visit our website at bafunde.com and register now. Bafunde, enhancing learning.